I'm John Strum, and this is RealTalk MS. It's June 10th, and we have a lot to talk about. This week, we're diving into part 2 of our coverage of the Consortium of MS Centers annual meeting, better known as CMSC. And one of the things I noticed about this year's meeting was the very balanced mix between presentations that focused on cutting-edge developments that will lead to future treatments or ways that MS will be diagnosed or even described in the not-too-distant future, as well as treatment and rehabilitation strategies that can be put into practice today. So I think the researchers, clinicians, advanced practice nurses, and rehabilitation specialists who were in attendance came away with an understanding of best practices in MS care today, as well as an understanding of how science is driving the continuing evolution of MS treatment and care. The first person I spoke with at CMSC was Dr. John DeLuca, the Senior Vice President for Research and Training and co-director of the Center for Multiple Sclerosis Research at Kessler Foundation. Dr. DeLuca's presentation at the meeting was focused on managing MS-related fatigue. Now, upwards of 80% of the people living with MS experience fatigue, and if you're among that 80%, I don't have to tell you how MS-related fatigue can get in the way of fully engaging in life. It can affect your job performance. It can impact your relationships at home. Fatigue can get in the way of any and every area of your life. And as of today, there isn't a medication that's been shown to mitigate fatigue. At CMSC, Dr. DeLuca shared his research demonstrating an effective behavioral approach to managing MS-related fatigue. And in a moment, we'll hear my conversation with Dr. John DeLuca. Dr. John DeLuca is a Senior Vice President for Research and Training and co-director of the Center for Multiple Sclerosis Research at Kessler Foundation, as well as a professor in the Physical Medicine and Rehabilitation and Neurology departments at Rutgers, New Jersey Medical School. And Dr. DeLuca's presentation at this year's CMSC annual meeting is entitled, "What Does the Brain Tell Us About Fatigue?" And I'll be asking you that in a moment. But first, I'm hoping you'll explain how MS-related fatigue is measured.
You know, it's really an important question because for over 100 years, we've been asking that question, and we don't have a good answer. We do not have a good answer of how we measure fatigue. And so we don't have a way of defining what it is, therefore we can't measure it, therefore how do we treat it? So it's a real problem. What we typically do is we use these instruments that presumably measure fatigue, but they're also contaminated by so many other factors, such as sleep and deconditioning and such, that we really don't know what we're measuring. So it's a real problem, unfortunately.
Why has fatigue proven to be so hard to treat? And I think you may have provided some of the answer just now.
Yeah, it's been really hard because, again, we have a hard time defining it, and therefore we can't measure it. 1921, Mucio asked, how do we measure an undefined entity? And we're still there today, and it's really a problem. So there may be things that we can do, but they're contaminated by other factors if you use these instruments. Therefore, we're not really measuring it. Even if people feel better, the instruments don't tell us that they are.
So now I'll go ahead and ask the question. What does the brain tell us about fatigue?
You know, it's really interesting. So we look at what's called state fatigue. That is fatigue in the moment. How do you feel right now on a scale of 0 to 100, as opposed to trait fatigue, are these instruments that are contaminated by these questions. And we put people in the MRI scanner and we cognitively fatigue them. And we measure their state fatigue before and after each one. And what we find is that state fatigue correlates with changes in the brain, functional changes in the brain. And that state fatigue does not correlate with trait fatigue, which does not correlate with changes in the brain. So what we know is that we have this brain network, and the hub of this brain network is the basal ganglia. And what's interesting is the basal ganglia is also the hub for the reward network in the brain. And so our approach is, if you can reward people, does reward actually reduce fatigue? And the data on that is actually yes. So the brain is telling us that if we understand how this network in the brain works, we understand this hub of the basal ganglia and its relationship between fatigue and on the other side, let's say reward, we can actually get to understanding how to measure it and then how to treat it.
And it sounds like the nature of that treatment is non-pharmacological.
Well, that's actually what happens right now. The best treatment for fatigue at this point is cognitive behavioral therapy. Okay. I think that ultimately there will be pharmacological treatment, but it's got to be more specific than what it is today. We have to understand the relationship between pharmacological therapy and reward as well as just fatigue. And so I think we're going to really move forward to understanding that relationship in that the brain is telling us what we need to look at.
There's also been some evidence that exercise can mitigate several MS symptoms, and fatigue has been listed as one of them.
Yes, actually there is data on fatigue. And interestingly, when you think about the data that I know from our center, the other hub in the fatigue network is the thalamus. And what's happening is that improvements from exercise are at the level of the thalamus. So that thalamus is also part of the fatigue network. So it all fits into a nice story. We just need to understand that relationship better. But if exercise is not rewarding, people won't do it.
Exactly right. Anyone who has taken out a gym membership understands that principle, don't they?
Exactly. So what we try to do is we try to ask patients, what is rewarding for you that you haven't been able to do for a long time? So let's say I love to read, but I don't read anymore because I can't remember it. Well, we get them to join a book club, or we get them to do something that's rewarding to them. And some people it's exercise, some people it's something else. And that seems to be something that really helps.
There are more than a few people dealing with MS-related fatigue who are listening to this conversation. Speaking generally, what's the best plan for mitigating that fatigue for someone with MS to pursue right now?
Yeah, I think it's to be honest with yourself and say, what is it that I can do that I haven't been able to do or I haven't wanted to do anymore? Be honest. Go out and try something that you'd love to do and stick with it. Start slow. If you used to exercise, start gardening. Start slow and try to build it up. Be honest with yourself and work with a professional, a neurologist, psychologist, occupational therapist to work on it. It's not going to happen overnight, but the brain is telling us that looking at what's happy, what makes us happy, what makes us really be motivated can actually reduce fatigue.
And that is perhaps the single best prescription I have ever heard.
Well, thank you. And I think it can help even those of us who don't have MS.
For sure. Dr. John DeLuca, I want to thank you for all you have done and continue to do to really improve the lives of people who are living with MS. And thanks so much for talking with me today.
Oh, thank you. It's been my pleasure, really.
Dr. Brian Sandroff is the Assistant Director of the Center for Neuropsychology and Neuroscience Research at Kessler Foundation and the Director of the Center's Exercise Neurorehabilitation Research Laboratory. I had an opportunity to talk with Dr. Sandroff and ask him some of the questions I've received from some of you about exercise and MS. In a moment, we'll hear my conversation with Dr. Brian Sandroff.
Dr. Brian Sandroff is the Assistant Director of the Center for Neuropsychology and Neuroscience Research at Kessler Foundation and the Director of the Center's Exercise Neurorehabilitation Research Laboratory. Now, the title of your presentation at this year's CMSC meeting is Exercise as an Approach for Mitigating Network Collapse in MS. And I want to ask you about that in a moment. First, I want to remind you of one of your past studies. A couple of years ago, you led a study that showed a robotic exoskeleton was effective in facilitating exercise rehabilitation among people living with MS who had already experienced significant disability. I remember sharing the results of that study with my listeners and talking about how technology was really driving progress in rehabilitation. How are you seeing MS rehabilitation evolving? Can you compare MS rehabilitation today with what it was like 10 or 15 years ago?
That actually was not a study that I led. That was from my colleague, Guy Thandrawis. I was helping out with that study. It's more of kind of a support system. And Guy's a great guy doing some really important work on robotics. But in answer to your question directly, over the last 10 to 15 years, things have gotten so much more closely aligned with the exercise as medicine movement in the general population, where we don't just tell our patients to go out and exercise. That doesn't mean much anymore. Now everything is starting to move towards precise prescriptions, exactly what to do, when to do it, how to do it. There are guidelines, and things are becoming more and more home-based now, especially since the COVID pandemic, where people have learned to value their time a lot differently now than they used to, where now people want things on their own, things that they can do themselves in a comfortable environment, because driving 30 minutes to and from a place costs a lot in terms of time and effort and, your ability to do things with your family and your job. So it's become a lot more telerehabilitation centric in recent years compared with previous years. So in terms of future directions, we're really moving towards trying to deliver things to where people are, as opposed to having them come to us.
Well, I think that's just a fantastic idea. And it's interesting how rehabilitation is moving more toward precision rehab, just as the rest of medicine is moving toward precision medicine.
Yeah, all of a sudden now you're starting to see studies in rehabilitation and MS on response heterogeneity, which looks at who might benefit the most from rehabilitation, from different programs. What characteristics people have at baseline that may predict improving more, or maybe people who don't respond to interventions that maybe might need a different intervention. So we're really trying to figure out how to help all people.
I'm going to ask you a couple questions that my listeners have asked me to ask.
Wow, okay.
Does the effect of exercise training appear on an MRI scan?
So it depends on what MRI scan. So if we're talking about a clinical MRI scan, not yet. And I'm going to say yet with kind of a wink in my eye, because we believe that so far what's been done in the literature has been short-term exercise. And we don't necessarily think that short-term exercise is long enough to show major changes on brain volumes. As if you think about the disease-modifying therapy literature, the drugs that show effects on brain volumes take 1 to 2 years to do so. So would 12 weeks of exercise necessarily be expected to change brain volumes? I don't think so. But I do think that exercise changes brain connectivity and brain activation in the short term, as there have been a number of studies published in the literature over the last couple of years that have shown improvements in functional brain outcomes. That is, how the brain gets activated in response to seeing a stimulus, or how it connects better at rest.
Depression is an MS symptom that affects about half the people who are living with MS. And when many people think about depression, they tend to think of antidepressants. Question one of my listeners has: can aerobic exercise have an impact on MS-related depression?
So there are a couple of studies out there that do support an effect. There are 3 meta-analyses, which are studies that look at the overall effects of exercise on an outcome in an entire field. And there are 3 of them for exercise effects on depression in MS. And all 3 show that exercise overall is associated with moderate-sized reductions in depressive symptoms in people with MS. Now, that doesn't guarantee that aerobic exercise will reduce depressive symptoms in one individual person, but overall, there are significant effects in MS.
Cognitive dysfunction is another invisible symptom of MS. Can exercise improve cognitive issues for people who are living with MS?
So that one is probably the closest to my heart, as that's where my research is most closely interested in. So overall, the evidence is a bit mixed, where some studies report cognitive improvements, others don't. But what we've been doing over the past decade plus is trying to figure out exactly what type of exercise, how intense it should be, what kind of cognitive domains should improve, what brain networks should improve in order to improve cognition. And we think we stumbled onto something important, where We believe that aerobic walking exercise represents an intervention to improve cognition in people with MS. And this is based on a series of 8 or 9 studies that we've been conducting since 2011. And we just finished a study that recruited people with MS-related cognitive processing speed impairment. And we showed that aerobic walking exercise done at home for 4 months resulted in clinically meaningful improvements in cognitive processing speed, which is the most common cognitive problem in MS. So we think we're onto something big, and we're excited for what the future is going to bring here.
Well, I think that is really encouraging news. I mean, it's one of the symptoms that impacts people in a profound way, where in some ways they don't feel like they're themselves anymore even. And to find out that there could be a non-pharmacologic, you don't need another pill or injection or infusion, but can actually do something healthy for yourself that's going to have an impact on that invisible symptom that people can't seem to get treated. That's remarkable.
Yeah, that is one of the most rewarding and exciting parts of our research agenda, is that cognitive problems in MS just lead to so many other problems, like problems making relationships, social isolation, having trouble driving, unemployment, among other things. And to be able to self-manage that and potentially, lessen the blow of cognitive impairment with walking more, with exercising, something that we have guidelines for, that we have programs that we can provide support for people who are interested in walking. That would really be our dream, is to put ourselves out of business.
That's great, really. So let's get to your presentation at this year's CMSC meeting. How is exercise a viable approach for mitigating network collapse in MS?
So I'm pausing for a minute because I'm trying to distill a 40-minute presentation down into a single question, and I love the question. There is a lot of momentum supporting exercise as an approach to do this, because the network collapse is essentially the hypothesis that functional problems and declines in MS are a product of the brain rewiring itself in the wrong way, causing brain atrophy or loss of volume in certain regions. And we think that exercise may provide the reverse of that, where it may be able to strengthen connections within the brain. It may be able to help preserve brain volume if the correct exercise program is administered for a long period of time. And we have some preliminary data to support that, such that we think that there's a lot of smoke going on right now, and we're looking for the fire. So we're in the process of applying for some large grants to test that very question of whether or not exercise can mitigate this network collapse as a major consequence of the disease.
Again, remarkable. A year ago at this very meeting, you and I talked a little bit about a framework that you proposed for study design that would make them a bit more uniform, a bit more usable, and increase the credibility of the outcome of those results. I'm just curious, are people getting that memo?
So far in the last year, I don't think there's been quite enough time for that to marinate, but I've definitely been reading studies that have given me kind of that wow moment, like, this is a really well-designed paper. These results are great. Wow, this is so promising and exciting. As an example, the cognitive rehabilitation literature is getting stronger and stronger and stronger from a methodological point of view, to where 5 years ago, the field was mixed, didn't really know if cognitive rehabilitation worked. But looking at the evidence, this morning I gave a presentation on kind of an update of that. And there is a lot of converging evidence supporting the benefits of cognitive rehabilitation now, to where studies are designed well. They're reporting improvements in the hypothesized direction. The papers themselves are reporting everything. There's more transparency. There's imaging data to support the cognitive data. So really exciting stuff.
Every time I talk to you, I learn new things. Dr. Brian Sandroff, I want to thank you for everything you do to really improve the lives of people who are living with MS. Thanks so much for taking a few minutes to talk with me.
Of course. Thanks, John. And I'm a huge fan of the podcast and what you're doing for people with MS as well.
Thanks.
The last conversation I had at CMSC was with Kristine Werner Ozug. Kristine is a member of the RealTalk MS team, and Kristine lives with MS, so I'm always interested in her perspective of the conferences and meetings we attend. In a moment, we'll hear my conversation with Kristine.
I'm with Kristine Werner Ozug, and we've spent the past 4 days attending the Consortium of MS Centers annual meeting. Kristine is a member of the RealTalk MS team, and as someone who's living with MS, what were your impressions of CMSC?
This was a great conference. As compared to ECTRIMS and ACTRIMS, this one's a little different. However, there was a little more science-based programming than in the past. But I like to think of this conference as what we learn in ECTRIMS and ACTRIMS from the science and the research. This one is for clinicians, healthcare providers, nurses, and rehabilitation specialists, maybe to how to take that science and that data and those recommendations and how to apply them in their everyday practice of treating people living with MS.
Well, speaking of the things that we've learned at past conferences, what did you learn at this meeting?
So there are a few sessions that caught my eye that I'd like to share with our listeners. And one of the first ones that we attended was about to switch or not, talking about disease-modifying therapies. And one of the key takeaways I had from that discussion was the involvement of the patient in that decision, or what we know as shared decision-making. And in switching therapies, to consider things like the evidence, the safety, tolerability, the costs, and affordability and access, any family planning, considerations, and of course efficacy. And another thing that was mentioned is this term called brain health, and we'll be discussing the theme of brain health because it comes up in a lot of the sessions that we attended. It's a common thread woven into the presentations throughout the conference. And another takeaway I had was the wellness and well-being is more than just the absence of disease. And again, this is that focus on people living with MS as an entire person and not just an image from an MRI.
You mentioned a couple of takeaways. What did you feel was the biggest takeaway from this conference for you?
That there are things that we can do living with MS that are called, modifiable factors that can actually preserve cognitive function and maybe preserve some neural reserve in our brain, and also help with, maybe staving off progression, as well as, having us live a happier life. Maybe it helps with fatigue. Maybe it helps with depression. There's still a lot of research that needs to be done in that area, but to know that we do have some control over the progression of our disease and living with the disease. That's kind of an overall takeaway I have.
So now that you teased the term modifiable factors, you want to share a couple of modifiable factors and talk about what you mean by that.
So with this term brain health, it includes things like sleep hygiene. It includes physical activity. It includes, staying up on your overall medical health. It also includes being mindful of your mental health fitness. It also includes being mindful of your social interactions. So really looking at you as a whole person and what you can do, food, nutrition-wise, all of those things I just mentioned to make yourself feel better and, help you live as well as you can while living with MS.
Any other programming that you saw that you felt was particularly powerful, particularly important?
Another one we attended was about an interdisciplinary approach to wellness. And this session is exactly what the title implies. We heard from a clinician, an occupational therapist, a physical therapist, and a speech therapist. And what really impressed me was one of the very first phrases I heard from Dr. Mary Rensall. She was speaking about motivational interviewing and how she's changed the way she begins her appointments with her patients that live with MS. And she starts by asking, what's going well for you? And this had a real impact on me for reasons I couldn't quite identify in the moment. But later, when you and I were talking about this, it became more apparent to me because in my appointments, and I don't know about our listeners, I am asked, things like, how are you doing? Or tell me how you've been doing, or you're feeling, or, what have you been up to? But because I'm hypercritical of myself, which maybe a lot of people are that are listening, I immediately jump to things that I may feel guilty about that I haven't accomplished, or that I'm not getting around to doing, or, things that I want to accomplish, but I haven't started yet. And I thought about, what if someone asked me what was going well for me, just to reframe it and kind of force me into that realm of positivity. So I couldn't get into that mode of the hypercriticality that I seem to fall into. Again, we heard about brain health in this session and the possibilities of being able to modify cognitive reserve by exercise and, sleep and relaxation techniques, and being mindful again of our mental health and food and nutrition. So again, this theme came up.
Like other MS research meetings we've attended, this meeting isn't really geared toward people with MS. It's not inexpensive, and the science is kept at a pretty high level. A lot of times that science-y jargon can be difficult to decipher. So I'm wondering, do we need to see a conference that is aimed specifically at people living with MS and their caregivers? An event that can bring everyone up to speed on the amazing MS research being conducted, but in easy to understand English.
Yes. And I would love to see that happen. You and I, especially you, do a great job of trying to talk about the conferences we attend, and we try to bring as much of the information as we can, and interviewing the researchers and the scientists that are doing this work. But we can't bring it all. We can't even bring a fraction of it. But if we had a conference or session, symposiums, and people could go and hear firsthand in plain language, about the things that they are interested in, it would be, I think, very rewarding. And I think the researchers could find it very rewarding as well.
I want to close out our conversation by asking you the same question that I asked several of the MS experts that we interviewed over the past few days. What do you see in MS research that has you excited?
Well, this talk and this fits nicely. We went to a talk about, if MS is one disease, what does it mean for our clinical conversations? And this was timed so nicely because last week we had a podcast about this very topic, and we've been presenting on this for a while in our podcast, updating people on the course descriptors. And this particular one had me excited, and it moved me a bit because I got a glimpse into the other side of the MS story, which is the difficulty that clinicians have in communicating with us. They don't always have the answers to our questions. And that gives me hope, because they're really thinking about what they can do for progression. Again, brain health. So that's getting me excited, because they're starting to research, what are things we can do right now, while we're waiting for medications for progression or neuroprotection or neuro repair. Although there are some really exciting medications on the horizon and more research being done on remyelination, those things are very exciting. But I think the non-pharmacological interventions are just, they're here now, and we can harness that and take control of that.
Well, Kristine, I want to thank you for sharing your perspective on the 2025 Consortium of MS Centers annual meeting.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful. So thank you.
That's going to wrap up this episode of Real Talk MS from the Consortium of Multiple Sclerosis Centers 2025 annual meeting. Real Talk MS is powered by the National MS Society, and you can share this episode of the podcast by letting your friends or family members know that all they have to do is point their web browser at realtalkms.com/406. You'll find that link in today's show notes, so you can easily copy and paste it right into an email or a text. And if you have a minute, I hope you'll visit the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store and download the free RealTalk MS app for your iOS or Android smartphone or tablet. It's the best way for us to stay connected. The app will automatically download the latest episode of Real Talk MS. You'll be able to access any of our past episodes. You'll be able to save your favorite episodes, and it's a great way for me to share bonus content with you. The app is free, so I hope you'll download it today. I'm John Strum. Thanks for listening. Stay safe and make healthy choices.